Hello everyone and welcome to today's SANS webcast. Sensitive Data Everywhere, Results of the SANS 2017 Data Protection Survey, sponsored by Infoblox and McAfee. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Barbara Filkins, Senior SANS Analyst, Benjamin Wright, SANS Senior Instructor, Cindy Chen, Senior Product Marketing Manager for Data Protection Solutions at McAfee, and Sam Kumarsamy. He works in Security Product Marketing at Infoblox. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Ben.
Thank you, Carol. With this webcast, we will start by looking at the results of a survey on data protection that we have just completed. And then we will go into discussion questions that key off of the topics of the survey question and the survey results. I will be the moderator today. One of my roles is to serve as the instructor at the SANS Institute for the course called The Law of Data Security and Investigations. In addition, I have the privilege of serving as the chairman of the SANS Institute's Data Breach Summit, which will be a two-day event covering many of these kinds of topics and more in Chicago later this month. And so we've already introduced the names of each one of the three speakers, Barb, Cindy, and Sam. We'll go right into the discussion and start with a presentation from Barb on what we learned from our data protection survey.
Okay, thank you, Ben. I think one of the things, and the results of the survey, the paper will be posted on the reading room if it's not there already, and if you look down in your chat box, the link will be posted sometime during this webcast. But I think one of the themes is that it's multiple threats and it's multiple times. In asking what our respondents consider to be the top threats to the security of their sensitive data, it's not surprising given today's world that ransomware, insider threats, and denial of service are the leading causes, not just once, but multiple times. And so in looking at the critical threats that can affect sensitive data, it's not just what the threats are, but it's also the fact that if you look at how those threats appear in terms of how many times they occur, we took another analysis component on this data, and it was something like 78% are experiencing 2 or more of these types of threats in the last 12 months, and 68% report the same threat multiple times. So even though we had a fairly low number that were actually breached or had sensitive data breached in the full sense of the word breach in this as a respondent to the survey, we also feel that because of this multiple threats multiple times, nobody can relax and say, you know, let's not worry because the statistics on an actual breach are fairly low relative to overall. Then looking at the types of data that were compromised, and this was actually very interesting. User login IDs and passwords and privileged credentials kind of were the top 2 items that attackers looked at, showing that they are prioritizing. These are the pieces that can actually give them unfettered access to the crown jewels of an organization's sensitive data, which can include customer identifiable personal information, intellectual data, or intellectual property, financial data, and so forth. So if the attackers are prioritizing, maybe the defenders should as well. And as a side note, in my world of healthcare, a lot of people consider the credentials that might be names and email addresses that are in a directory address or a directory listing They aren't necessarily treated as sensitive or confidential information when perhaps they should. For those that were breached, the leading causes are malware-related attacks and insider threats, with primary transports for exfiltration being encrypted channels, email, and that the number that actually experienced exfiltration of sensitive data via email, also that was tied with the number that experienced physical theft of assets as far as exfiltration, physical threat or physical theft of or loss of a laptop or, let's say, a mobile device. And then the third leading cause was DNS. Again, the percentages of those who were actually breached were relatively low, but even so, the large number of multiple threats and multiple times those threats occur should be a red flag that protection is needed. The challenges that our respondents cited were largely policy enforcement. That was the leading challenge. And policy can actually be taken in two ways. It can be taken in terms of those administrative controls, the written policies and procedures, and how you can enforce those through actionable and enforceable events, as well as potentially the fact that you have network policies and controls as well. But policies being the leading challenge is not surprising, considering that the top three drivers for data protection are internal data compliance, monitoring contracts with business partners, especially important in a cloudy world, and organizational standard practices. Regulatory requirements didn't necessarily enter in as the top elements, and one of the reasons may be that those regulatory requirements are built into those internal policy compliance and organizational standard practices that are part and parcel of that particular industry or that vertical industry. The top two practices for data protection are admin policies and procedures and employee training, both of which would be considered more of a management control, not necessarily a technical control. And so this possibly brings us to a data protection disconnect, which is we found also that the majority of our respondents, 88%, are moderately or totally confident being able to locate sensitive data, yet most still rely on manual processes, both as shown before in terms of policies and procedures and employee training or workforce training, but also in terms of locating the sensitive data in their network or on their system. So the questions are raised, what about the sources that are often overlooked, like backups of local user workstations, shadow data that can occur, sensitive information on user workstations, and access and identity information like those user directories I mentioned before. So this is kind of leading us into today's discussion. We're going to discuss best practices for data protection, how you might get started with achievable first steps so you don't have to go out and invest a lot of money in a high-end tool, and then the tools themselves, both the, quote, traditional tools for network and endpoint levels, and then what other tools are out there that can be added to that traditional arsenal but are not necessarily fully used in today's environment. But before we get into those discussions, I'd like to pass it back to Ben for a word from Ben.
Thank you, Barb. One of the things that I observed as I listened to your summary of what we learned from the survey is you said that the top three drivers for data protection don't include regulatory requirements. So I thought about that for a moment, and I thought, you know, there are regulatory requirements both in the United States and outside of the United States, but I suspect that for a lot of organizations, they realize that their larger risk is not the regulator. Their larger risk is that they're going to be breached and that their sensitive data will be stolen. And that, of course, has a massive impact on the organization. It impacts their reputation, but it also impacts them from an operational perspective. And therefore, for a lot of organizations, even highly regulated organizations, the first question they ask is, how do I protect my data? Not, how do I satisfy the regulator, though I do need to take into consideration the methods for addressing the regulator and audits from the regulator. Another important point that came out to us as we were evaluating the results of the survey is, as Barbara indicated, the key things, the top things that the attackers are looking for as they probe an organization, attempt to get into an organization, are logon credentials and privileged accounts or privileged credentials. And it's obvious that defenders are therefore motivated to try to find ways to protect these particular things. As Barb indicated, if the attackers are going after a certain kind of thing, like logon credentials and privileged accounts, then the defender is wise to really spend a lot of time thinking, how can I protect that? If I know that that's the crown jewel, then I want to take special efforts to protect that crown jewel. And so one of the things we suggested, and we can move to the next slide, in the paper that we've published with the survey, is that there's a point of view that I have ingested by hanging around in the SANS world. And this point of view is very well promoted by John Strand and Bryce Galbraith. Instructor John Strand and Bryce Galbraith teach a class called Active Defense, and they make I think a compelling point that says that today there are so many different ways that you can try to protect your data and protect your network and protect your infrastructure, but we are not winning very much. We lose a lot, and John says we got to change things, and he says we have to throw the human element of surprise at the attackers. And so, yes, we need to have all kinds of tools. We need to have automated methods for evaluating attacks and finding attacks and protecting data and encrypting data and all that type of thing. All those things are good. But John says we need to go one step further to be more effective today. And that includes doing things that the defenders don't expect. And you can call them active defense, you can call them other kinds of things, but they include doing things that are custom to your particular situation. And so, for example, John teaches the idea of setting up a honey account or a honey document. So a honey account, for example, is a fake administrator account. It looks like an administrator account, and it's very attractive to an attacker. Because why? Attackers are looking for administrator accounts. Attackers think, oh, if I could get into an administrator account, then I'm going to be able to do something powerful. And therefore, John creates a fake administrator account. But there's only one purpose for that administrator account. That is a trap, in effect, that sends an alarm to the administrator that says somebody's trying to get into your honey account. Well, the only person who would try to get into the honey account is an attacker. Normal users would never try to get into that, and the administrator team, they would never try to get into that account because they know it is a honey account. It's only there to send us an alarm. Then, if you get an alarm that says somebody's trying to get into your administrator account, you now have a clue. And with a clue, you can start tracing back through your network and try to figure out who got in, how they got in, what are they doing, and then you can start finding ways to counteract whatever they're doing or kick them out of the network. Similarly, John Strand and Bryce Galbraith in their active defense class teach a bunch of other techniques for harassing or wasting the time of an attacker. So they teach methods for setting up spider traps, for example. And a spider trap is a custom thing. You do it custom for your organization. You don't necessarily have the same kind of spider trap across multiple different organizations, because if every organization had the same kind of spider trap, then the attackers would be aware of that, they'd be expecting it, and then they'd figure out ways to avoid the spider trap. So what's a spider trap? A spider trap is a tool that sends an attacker into an infinite loop. So the attacker sends his spider, his crawler that's crawling all over your network or your web page, and he's trying to figure out where are the data entry points, where are the logon points, and what are other aspects of your a web page, your network. He's trying to do reconnaissance to figure out where your weaknesses are. John says, well, wait a minute. If I know that an attacker would try to do something like that, then I'm wise to try to set up a loop or a surprise or something that sends the attacker off in a strange direction or fills up his a hard drive with a bunch of junk data, because the only person who would try to send a spider against me would be, one, an attacker, or two, a penetration tester. And I don't want either of those guys to figure out how to get into my network. So when they start behaving like a pen tester or an attacker, then I'm going to show them something that they don't expect, that they've never seen, that they didn't know was going to appear at my network or my website. And so my larger idea here is John and Bryce are thinking to the next step. They're recognizing that if you set up your organization, your network, your infrastructure in ways that are surprising and that have unique human elements, then you're doing something that will help to protect your most valuable asset, which is your logon credentials and your privileged accounts, your administrative type of accounts. We can move to the next slide. So a question that arises, John and Bryce talk about this in their class. I talk a lot about this in my Law of Data Security and Investigations class as well. There can be questions about, well, if I trick a hacker and I start gathering data about her and I'm monitoring her as she's accessing my honeypot or my honey file or my honey account or whatever it may be, could I be violating the law? And there might be some interesting questions about whether you are eavesdropping on someone illegally and violating some law around the world as you collect information about them, or you even give their information to the police. And so an important way to address that concern is to publish a banner. And a banner might be something like this that I've quoted in the second bullet point. Warning, no trespassing. We monitor our network and we turn over the data we collect to the police. If you trespass onto our network, you consent to us deceiving you and monitoring you and your communication. So in effect, the attacker or the penetration tester, as they come onto your network, they see a contract and they agree by contract. Oh, you can deceive me. I agree you can deceive me. I agree that you can have a honey file. And when I touch that honey file, I think I'm opening up a spreadsheet that's got, passwords on it. But in fact, it is just a dummy file that's intended to send an alarm to the administrator. And so, to kind of quote Bryce Galbraith, he says, it's your house. When they're in your house, you know your house. You know where things are. You know where the honeypot is. You know where the honey file is. The attacker doesn't know your house. He doesn't know that you set up a honey account, for example, and therefore you can set up traps and tricks for that guy, similar to the Home Alone story in the famous movie where the kid at home set up traps for the burglars, and the burglars didn't know the traps were there. So my larger message here is that there can be and should be many different unconventional types of steps that we should consider as we protect our most important assets, which are logon credentials and privileged accounts. So let's move to the next slide, and we will then slide into our discussion of our three major topics. So in effect, we're going to have a panel discussion here, including Barb and Cindy and Sam. And each of our panelists will offer some perspective on, first, best practices for data protection, second, achievable first steps as any kind of organization tries to get into position for data protection. And then finally, we'll look at many different kinds of tools, both traditional tools and other tools that are appropriate for data protection. So if we'll move to the next slide, we then can start with the first of our three topics. And Barbara is going to kick us off with a little bit of data from our survey on what are the best practices to follow.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Really, in terms of best practices, one of the things that comes forward, and this is probably a little bit of my mantra also, is we found that most of the places the critical or sensitive data is used in storage is by far databases and servers, storage and backup systems, and then organizationally managed user endpoints. There's less of an emphasis on applications in the cloud or third-party locations. But in today's world of virtualization, we're finding also that the hybrid environments that are a mix of on-prem and cloud are complicating the compliance just from the standpoint of the boundaries are no longer a fixed physical box, and that a lot of the data protection or a lot of the network services and data protection tools that we've used in the past actually need to look at a different perspective on the perimeter, maybe one that is defended by network services like DNS or other aspects in terms of encryption both on the wire and at the endpoint. But one of the things that, and I will inject a little bit, we asked, but we injected this question based on my background, is that one of the starting points is to come up with a data classification schema in terms to understand, just as you have a defense in depth on an overall network or an overall system, you also look at defense in depth around data, starting with your most critical or most sensitive data at the core, and then working outwards for information or data elements that are need less and less protection until they finally emerge into the public domain. So one of the starting points on that data classification schema also allows kind of a way of prioritizing and then a way of looking at what would be the best practices to follow in kind of a risk-related structure or a prioritized structure as well. And so with that, I would like to pass this to Cindy for her to add her thoughts in terms of best practices.
Thank you, Barbara. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Ben, Barbara, before I dive into some of the technology that you mentioned here, I'd like to talk about the importance of people, process, and technologies in that order. Since we're talking about best practice here, I always tell my customers that you can have the best data protection technologies in place, but if your employees are not being careful, doing stupid things, or if you have a broken process in your business that a cyber criminal or the disgruntled employee can take advantage of, your sensitive data will be leaked out. So when I talk about people, I'm talking about educating the employees, increasing their security awareness. I think Bob, you mentioned about insider threat is one of the top concerns for some of the companies based on your survey. I'm not just talking about once a year those compliance training because very little is retained after a week. I'm talking about in your data protection best practice and tools, designing some real-time feedback. For example, a real-time pop-up window. The example will be like if an employee is trying to copy some financial data onto a UBS, whether she's doing it intentionally or by mistake, a real-time pop window will show up on the desktop and says, this violates the company policy. Please go to this internal site for more education. This way, the employee's behavior is reinforced right away. Another one I want to comment on the process is that I highly recommend, for all the IT folks who are actually sitting, listening onto this panel, is that you bring the business holders early on, such as the BU leaders, the HR, the compliance team, get their buy-in before you start implementing your data protection program. Because these are the people who are actively using the data you're trying to protect on a daily basis. So this is my, a couple of my best practices for my recommendation for data protection program.
Thank you, Cindy. This is Sam. So I have a different approach to this. In the survey, it was indicated that DNS is one of the means for data exfiltration, and also the fact that malware is an important way of getting into into your, malware as a way of propagating into your organization. So what happens typically is DNS is often the most ignored threat vector because it's something new that needs a lot more education. DNS is a protocol that can be exploited for reconnaissance, just like I think Ben was just talking about reconnaissance. So it can be used for harvesting email addresses and conference information or other type of sensitive information. Because once you have an email address, you can weaponize it with an attachment, for example, and deliver it via DNS to an end user device or to an end user. Once the end user clicks on the email link, it connects to a command and control site that downloads malware to the end user device and then spreads laterally. Now it can remain dormant for a while and then start exfiltrating sensitive information. You know, you might have all sorts of protection for web and email traffic. You know, you have your typical firewalls, web proxies, intrusion prevention systems, and so on, but they do not protect your DNS. So to me, at least from what we have seen from an Infoblox perspective and a best practices perspective, we found that we have to educate our customers a lot on the importance of protecting your DNS. Now, the surveys that we have had also proves that DNS is a means of exfiltrating data. So some of the surveys that we have seen or we have used effectively in educating our customers is the fact that 91% of the malware uses DNS to carry out campaigns. And this is basically a 2016 Cisco survey. And intruders rely on DNS to infect devices and propagate malware. And the malware is designed to morph as well. You know, from malware is often the most used means of to exfiltrate data. It hides into your infrastructure. It takes longer to discover because it's dormant for a period of time, and then over a period of time it starts exfiltrating data. In another survey, by SC Magazine, which surveyed over employees over organizations with over 1,000 employees at the C level and the B level, 46% of the survey respondents said they experienced some sort of DNS data exfiltration. So again, proving to you and validating the fact that DNS needs to be protected. And also 45% of the survey respondents experienced DNS tunneling. DNS tunneling is nothing but using some known tools or known signatures to exfiltrate data. And they are used to send sensitive information out. And data is also embedded in DNS queries. So from a best practices perspective, you really need to be aware of disrupting the cyber kill chain, basically. You need to enforce policies using up-to-date threat intelligence information. So whatever information you have on the malicious URLs, host names, domain names, and IP addresses, make sure that they are the latest information and have no false positives. You need to protect the users both on and off-prem. Don't forget, many of them have hybrid environments, both on-prem and off-prem. You need to block this malware communications at the DNS control plane from a best practices perspective. And do not forget, data exfiltration happens through a combination of reputation, which I just talked about, known malicious bad neighborhoods, signatures, we talked about DNS tunneling, and also be aware that, in order to do zero-day threats, you need to be looking at behavioral analytics for some real-time data exfiltration, which can happen through queries, texts that are sent out in chunks and reconstructed on the other side. And last but not the least, we need to know where our assets are. As the question begs, there used to be back in the 1980s and 1990s, a question used to be asked at 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are? Similarly, do you know where your assets are? Do you know if they're vulnerable? You need to have a holistic database of all your network assets where you're able to discover, and any changes made into your network environment, you need to keep all of that in a central location so that you can mine that information and actually have relative information when you're looking up for any changes. What is the username, MAC address, and so on. So from a best practices, it's very important from all these aspects.
Yeah, Sam, I totally agree with you. I think you hit a really great point. In order to protect your most sensitive data, you not only need to protect the data itself, but also, the systems, the devices, but also you need to educate your employees on top of that. I think all of them kind of come together to implement a very successful data protection program.
And exactly, Cindy, and I agree to your point as well. I just emphasized on DNS, that's often ignored, but obviously you need your intrusion prevention systems, you need your SANS, you need your firewalls, and you need your web proxies as well to make sure there is no data exfiltration or malware communications happening via those different protocols as well,
yep,
such as web and email traffic.
All right, very, very good. We're off to a good start here with our panel discussion. We'll move to our second topic now, where we wish to hear from our panelists. What are the achievable first steps? What are wise things that organizations should do first as they begin with modern data protection? So we'll turn back to Barb and see what we learned from the survey.
Well, what we learned, Dan, is that 62% are moderately confident and 26% are totally confident that they have a good handle on their data protection processes. But when you start to look at how you locate your sensitive data assets, we find that majority, almost 60%, are dealing with manual processes. And for me, this is a little bit of a red flag. And touching back on what Cindy said about automation, I can say from a general perspective as well as from a security perspective that a lot of time companies or organizations can spend a great deal of time automating a process only to find out that they've automated a bad process, and that in the long run they may have been better off trying to engineer what they did so that it takes into account things like the security of the interface, employee being able to provide some type of technology-based tool to improve the workforce awareness, even in the terms of prevention, such as you might see with a DLP solution. And the other part of this, going back to what Sam said on configuration, knowing where your sensitive data is located. There's lots of places where data can be hidden, it can be cached. The attackers a lot of times know where to look. It can be DNS, it can be browser caches, it can be directory structures that are buried down within the Windows or Linux system. And so having an ability for automation to help in that is actually a good place, and we'll touch on that when we get to the tools. But I think in terms of what are achievable first steps, for me, one of the things would be going back to that idea of the process, the people, process, and technology. If you know who's handling your information, or who should be handling your information, and you know how that information, the data, the information, and the metadata that is related to that information flows in your network, that's a real critical first step in this whole thing. And that is actually kind of a blind spot we found when we looked at some other aspects of the survey. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Sam for his thoughts on achievable first steps.
Thank you, Barbara. Just picking up from where the survey left and my last statement, I think one of the first things is, again, I want to double click on the fact that you need to know where your assets are, especially from a systems perspective. You need to be able to visualize your network clearly. And what I mean by that is see every network asset, every IP address, switch port, and all that in a central location. What I call as network discovery, be it whether you're using SNMP, CLI, or whatever the means you're doing, you need to be, again, automating that entire process. You don't want to make it manual, tedious, and prone to errors. You want to be automatic, continuously be able to track multi-vendor infrastructure, for example, end hosts, network constructs such as routers, VLANs, now I am talking layer 2, layer 3, virtual forwarding, routing, etc., and all sorts of topology, so you know how your network is constructed, where your assets are, and so on. And you need to be able to consolidate all of this into a single comprehensive database, because that's when you can have that single view of all your assets to get actionable insights. I think that is very important, because you need to know where your assets are, because no matter what kind of a defense in depth you have, you need to look at it from a systems perspective. So you need to be able to manage all these diverse devices, and as your network grows, you need to be able to add into this database. And I think that discovery and visibility, to me, is the key in knowing and making sure you're able to secure your infrastructure. Then identifying any types of new unmanaged network elements quickly. You need to be able to do that. So anything coming in, new network device, you need to be able to scan it immediately and make sure it's compliant with your latest security policies. And if not, to be alerted, whatever the means it might be, through an automat. Again, automation is the key here as well. And not only that, because you have all these different types of diverse plethora of security systems, because no single vendor can solve all of a company's security pain points, you need to be able to inform your other, so what we call a security ecosystem. For example, any DNS indicators of compromise, you need to be able to forward it to a SIEM or a next generation firewall, for example, so that they can take action from there, because you typically have SIEMs such as Splunk or so on in your environment, and you want to be able to take action based on all of this. So that's why it's important to have a very clear visual of what your network assets are. Cindy, your thoughts on that?
Well, thank you, Sam. Yeah, I can agree with Barb and Sam more that you absolutely need to know where your sensitive data resides. I would say that you cannot protect the data you don't know about, right? So I can quickly summarize some of the achievable first step into 3 categories. Data at rest, like both Sam and Barb said, that is to do the discovery and classification, to understand, where sensitive data is residing, and then and how it's being used. It's a very important first step. But on the endpoint, for the data in use, many of my data protection customers start with device control and endpoint encryption. Endpoint encryption meaning both the disk encryption as well as file and folder encryption. Those are relatively easy to implement and pretty straightforward. And then on the network side, we actually have something called integrated DLP with email gateway or web gateway, because we're talking about something that's easy, achievable, first step to do. So I understand that in order to implement a full-on data protection program can be very difficult and time-consuming. So I would recommend you pick the low-hanging fruits. So if you have an email gateway or email SaaS or web SaaS, web gateway technology that has integrated data protection like DLP policies, you can start with that. Monitor the data that's going outside your email traffic, web traffic, leverage the data protection policy, the email policies, and leverage your encryption, email encryption to encrypt that data and to block and remediate data. That will be a very easy first step to monitor all the information that's going outside your network.
I completely agree with you, Cindy. And in addition to that, what we also recommend from a best practices is, because we are the leading DDI vendor, we also recommend reporting and reporting tool that gives you visibility into the infected endpoints, because when you integrate into our DDI and our IPAM database, you get contextual information such as the username, MAC address, device type, and lease history that gives you the kind of visibility, not only from a historical perspective, but also be able to make develop predictive reports based on historical information, and we provide all sorts of customizable reports and enable you to make prediction on any type of failure that's going to happen as well. And that's why you're able to harness these actionable insights to monitor and analyze. So one is the visibility, followed by reporting capability as well. So once you have all the information about your systems, network, devices, and all that, you should be able to report on that so that any changes that are happening, you can immediately view through a reporting capability. So those, I would think, are the first steps.
Yep, absolutely. And I also want to mention that a lot of my customers, when they first started implementing data protection program, they're only in monitoring mode. They're not really blocking. And I can understand why they do that, but my recommendation is once you understand where all your data resides, you're understanding how the data is going from one place to another, start blocking as soon as possible. Because when a breach happens in your company, the regulation industry is not going to care whether you had all the check boxes, you purchased the best enterprise DLP system, for your company. When the breach happens, there's going to be a fine and your reputation will be affected. So start blocking as soon as possible.
Very good. Thank you very much, Cindy, Barb, and Sam. We'll move on to our third topic, and we'll look at tools. And we've got quite a bit to cover here. We have good experts on tools. So Barb, tell us what we learned from the survey.
Okay. Well, we actually had two different ways of looking at things, not surprisingly. First one is we all have the tools that are available to us already, either it's part of our operating system utilities, or just because we're on the internet and we're using TCP/IP as the transport. And so from the network perspective, we have things like encryption, SSH, SSL, VPNs, and so forth, access controls, identity and access management controls, firewalls, and UTM. And then on the endpoint, we have email security and vulnerability management and host-based encryption as kind of the leading contenders. And some of these do actually overlap a little bit because, and we had this discussion internally with this group, is something like email security. It's both a network protocol, and you can also consider it as an endpoint when you start looking at the fact that it will actually place data in effectively what I'll call a repository on your phone, your mobile device, or your workstation, totally depending on how the email system is architected. So this was the first element to look at. How can we leverage our traditional tools? Then the second question was, is there anything else that's out there that's specific to data protection that might be beyond what we would consider the traditional arsenal? And looking at data sources that are being used for root cause analysis when a breach occurs, a lot of people use log data from the SIAM system, but things like user activity monitoring, behavioral analysis, and those kind of elements that are beginning to come to the forefront, being able to map your sensitive data automatically just as you might do an automated network map, those types of things are still, I would consider, kind of in a quiescent or a beginning stage, if you will. And so with that, I would like to turn this back over, can start with Cindy, and I think what we might want to do is flip back and forth between this idea of leveraging traditional tools versus what can we add to that traditional arsenal. And I will leave that open to both Sam and Cindy on how they want to respond.
Okay, thank you, Barb. Yeah, so it's interesting. So depending on the size of your company, I would say a majority of companies probably in their second or third wave of implementing a data protection technology, whether it's just device control or full-on DLP program. I feel like the landscape has changed for data protection going from content-aware to context-aware. So we're talking about, traditional tools, it's all very familiar, everyone, like device control, DLP, encryption on the data protection side, but then also, there is, email security, email encryption, web gateway security, and all that. Those are all the traditional tools. I want to say is every time when I look at those tools, I feel like today for folks, it's not just about using those tools because everyone's aware of those tools. It's all about how do you have a holistic approach that you can combine those tools, tying all those data protection tools together in a way that, for example, you can leverage a simple data protection policy to protect a piece of data wherever it goes. not to have multiple policies, not to have different parts not talking to each other. This way is not going to help you reduce administrative overhead and improve business efficiency, right? And I think Sam mentioned, the cyber kill chain is these days cyber criminals are getting very smart. You might have the best of breed tools out there, but it's more important how you get those two to talk to each other, right? How do you implement a simplified data protection tool, not only effective protecting your data, reduce false positive, but also outsmart those cyber criminals who are currently always inventing new technologies to beat out those tools that you currently have. So I would say for the traditional tools, in addition just to looking at, oh, what's the best tool out there, what are the different vendors I should consider, but really look at a holistic approach. The approach should really match your business needs, right? You can have all the best tools out there, but if they don't help you, if they don't cater to your business, those tools are useless. So definitely design a holistic approach, design a simple but effective data protection policy that can help you address how you protect this data, whether this data is residing on your laptop, someone might lose it at the LAX airport, or this data is being transferred into the cloud, whether employees using shadow IT, sanctioned or unsanctioned application, but really have that piece of data policy that follow that piece of data wherever it goes. Because these days, we all know the corporate parameters disappearing. Sam, any comments?
Yeah, so Cindy, well put. So I want to expand on that, and this is where the whole DNS, protecting your DNS comes into play, because it's in addition to the email security and the traditional web-based security that I talked about, it's really, really important to make sure that, one of the surveys said log data from SIEM, but SIEMs typically don't collect DNS data, unless it's forwarded to them. And that's where, companies such as Infoblox can help, because what we actually do is we have a security ecosystem integration. And when I say we, in terms of best practices, you got to work, as Cindy pointed out, in a holistic way. So if SIEMs are being used as a central location to aggregate data, we can help them. We in terms of threat intelligence as well, in terms of collecting data, both external and internal intelligence that we develop on our own using Infoblox, but also leverage external threat intelligence for up-to-date information on DNS, bad neighborhood sites like the CNC sites, like bad IP addresses, host names. It's actually consolidating all the threat intelligence and being able to curate that and apply it not only to your DNS but also to third-party tools, such as enhancing your SIEM with the DNS data. So that integration part that Cindy talked about is absolutely, she hit the nail on the head, is where we can help from a DNS security perspective. So this is the new tool in addition to your traditional tools that you need to look at. And enforce policy as well to make sure there are no false positives, and that's where the curation of the threat intelligence happens. And I also talked about, don't be caught up with only protecting users. People are moving to the cloud, but there are people hesitant. So make sure from a best practices, depending on what your environment is, you need to make sure that you have tools accordingly. And that's where even Infoblox helps, because we address both, we address a hybrid environment. And when you talk about data exfiltration, I talked previously as well about having not only looking at it from reputation and signature based, but also doing that behavioral analytics using machine learning and real-time analytics to predict any real-time data being exfiltrated. Are they being sent out in chunks? It's using the DNS protocol. So these are some of the new things that Infoblox can help with and enhance your existing security system. So it's not about working in isolation, but working holistically to help customers look at threats. So not only from email and web traffic, but also the DNS traffic, and that's where I think the new way of looking at data and tools you need to be aware of.
Absolutely, Sam. And I know both Sam and Barb touched upon the UBA, user behavior analysis, also called UEBA, user entity behavior analysis. This is actually due to the increased threat of the insider threat. So these are some of the new tools that's becoming more and more popular because those UBA and UEBA tools can address the broader concern looking at the malicious and abusive behavior that a traditional SIM and DLP technology may not be able to catch. Also, another new tool that's coming out around data exfiltration is not only can help you identify those data, but also help you monetize those data. For example, as you're doing your discovery and classification, you also have this analytic tool that tells you, okay, so for this piece of structured data that's residing on your internal database, how much it will cost you if you lose that data. So there are definitely some interesting tools out there that I feel like different companies can leverage these days to make their data protection even smarter.
Absolutely.
Can I add a quick word on that, Ben?
Yes, you please may do that.
I was going to say that what Cindy just mentioned as that last piece of technology, given the fact that we're looking at this whole realm of concern over cyber insurance and being able to protect your assets and make monetary decisions, seems like that would be technology that would be of great interest to that segment, cyber insurance, both the underwriters, the brokers, and the insured.
Indeed, from the point of view of boards of directors and executives, insurance is a traditional method for addressing risk, and many boards of directors recognize that they actually have a fiduciary responsibility for addressing risk. Yes, they want to hire the proper staff to use the proper technical tools, but insurance is another tool that is not technical but is recognized legally and from an operational perspective as helping to manage risk. So we coming to the point where we'll have a couple of wrap-up comments from each of Cindy and Sam. And if I recall correctly, Cindy's the first one for wrapping up.
Sure.
Barb, if you could advance the slide there.
Yeah, here's just a quick summary points. I just want to say it's been a great honor for me to be on this panel with my colleagues like Ben, Barb, and Sam. When it comes to protecting your most sensitive data, I cannot emphasize enough. Please look at the process of people, process, technology components in that order, right? And also, as I mentioned, I'm a big fan of holistic approach. Yes, you can have best of breed data protection tools out there to arm your data protection program, but you really need to look at what exactly your organization needs, right? We talk about defense in depth. We talk about killing doing the cyber kill chain. It's all about having your tools talk to each other. So McAfee offers a EPO platform. I think most of you are aware of. We also have our new DXL platform. The advantage of that is it will be able to plug in different technologies, and not just McAfee technologies, but also our partner technologies onto the same DXL bus and be able to share that information. So this way we can quickly respond to threats and proactively protect your data, not just from the malware and the viruses, but also be able to help you recognize which systems is compromised first, and then lock down that system to prevent data exfiltration, and hence protect your data and brand.
Thank you, Cindy. So from Infoblox perspective, you need to look at it from a data protection and malware mitigation perspective. I think I talked about three clear sections or chunks. One is the disruption of the cyber kill chain from a DNS perspective. Make sure you block all activity right at the DNS control plane, because that's the entry point. Enforce policies with the latest up-to-date threat intelligence about the malicious sites. Protect users both on and off-prem. I think that's important from a best-of-breed perspective. so that you can prevent any sort of lateral movement of threats. Cindy touched on the point, again, very important to pass on or share the DNS indicators of compromise with the ecosystem, your security ecosystem. 3 methods of data exfiltration, something that we do on a unique basis. We are the only DDI vendor that can combine signatures, reputation, behavior-based analytics to prevent DNS-based data exfiltration. And also, we can enforce it both on cloud or on-prem, because that is important. Some customers do not want to send data to the cloud, and we can help with that as well. And let's not forget, you need to know where your assets are. You need to have a reporting tool, because any configuration changes, any infected device, that's where, being the leading DDI vendor, we can provide that integration that allows you to have visibility into the end user devices, MAC addresses, their IP lease agreement, and so on, so that you can have context. And you need context to know how to prioritize the threats. And we do curation of that information as well. So that's what we have to avoid brand damage, financial and legal implications caused by data breaches and malware is what we pride ourselves in, and it's one of the means. And we integrate that with our DDI infrastructure. So we are extending the DDI infrastructure and adding security to it for DNS. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sam and Cindy. We appreciate your input. We now will turn to a question or two. Carol, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. Thanks for asking. Our first question is, could you clarify blocking data or data?
Yeah, sure. I can answer that question. So blocking data, meaning, I guess that comes to monitoring versus blocking. So one of the initial practices for data protection is you understand, where your data resides, and then you kind of track, that data in motion. And then you have the option of just monitoring data. You can set a policy, and you can see what kind of sensitive data is being sent out of your organization, via the email gateway or web gateway, right? Of your egress points. So at this point, you actually have a decision to make. You can passively monitoring it and still collect the information for analysis. You can actually block it. Block it meaning you actually do some remediation, meaning that you either stop it from sending it out, or you can apply encryption, or you can delete it. So block is actually a remediation action in addition to blocking. That's what I meant by blocking the data from leaving your organization.
Thanks, Cindy. We have a limited budget. What should I say to management to get approval for us to get started on mapping where our data is?
So that's a kind of a broad question. I think depending on what the limited budget is, I think you still need a network discovery tool in order to discover. So I'm not going to mention the names of the tools out there, but I think you should consider a tool that's within the budget, because like I mentioned constantly in my presentation, unless you know where your assets are, you can have all sorts of defensive mechanism, email gateway, web gateway, or even a DNS security. But your foremost is having visibility into where your assets are, and if a new asset comes in, you want to make sure that you're immediately alerted and make sure that it's compliant with your security policy, because otherwise that could be the means of getting breached. So I think just because the question is so broad, but I think you do need, based on the budget, there are many tools that you can look for network discovery, because again, you need visibility into your assets, and typically you want to have it in a central location so that you can mine for insights as well as look to report on it as well.
All right, thank you. This next one's for Cindy. Do you recommend that I start with endpoint data protection or network data protection?
Oh, this is actually a common question I often get. It totally depends on what your company needs. No one can implement a full-on data protection program to cover all egress points, endpoint, network, cloud at the same time. It's just very, very difficult. You probably need a full, 20-person staff in order to do that. So I would recommend you look at the low-hanging fruit. Really choose and pick your battle to fight. So if you think your, the most critical data leakage point is via your outbound email, then I would recommend you do network email blocking first. But if you think your greatest threat currently is USB, data leakage via your employee copying data onto USB, that would start with device control first. So there's no right answer. Really look at what your company needs, and then start with the most critical asset, breach point first.
Would anyone like to add anything?
No, that's fine. Again, we look at it from a DNS perspective. So, apparent, you need to look at it from a malware perspective, which is obviously from a network security. We do not do any endpoint protection, but however, we work with endpoint companies such as Carbon Black in order to mitigate. And, we also, I think we are working on a relationship, or we are working on a relationship with McAfee as well. So that we can pass on our indicators of compromise to endpoints such as Carbon Black for them to start taking action on the endpoint. So my answer to that is a combination of both, but we look at it from a network perspective, but we understand the endpoint security is absolutely important, and therefore we integrate with endpoint security solutions and moving forward.
And I would say, Carol, from a general perspective, it's where you place your risk, either as perceived or actually in terms if you've been able to actually inventory and capitalize on what your assets are and their configuration and the possible threat, as well as vulnerabilities. So.
All right, well, with that, we're out of time. Thank you so much, Barbara, Ben, Cindy, and Sam, for your great presentation, and to Infoblox and McAfee for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.